us a bit about how you started to write for young audiences.
Yeah, I did a lot of work with young audiences. So before I was making any kind of a living as a writer, I was doing lots of education work, lots of work with young audiences. And essentially it just began where often in my plays I had young characters in my plays for adults. So I was always interested in characters that were young characters. And then essentially it just began where I was having a meeting at the Hampstead Theatre about a play I'd written for adults called Mother of Him, which they weren't doing, but we were having a meeting about it. And they were telling me about their work, and one of the bits of work they did was something with their Heat and Light young people's company, where they commissioned 3 writers a year, one for each of their 3 age groups they work with, to write a new play. And essentially at that meeting I just said, I want to write one of those plays. And then a year and a bit later, they had decided, okay, well, we'll consider him for that, and put my name forward to a panel of young people and an extract of some of my work. And the young people commissioned me to write one of the plays. So essentially to start a writer said, yeah, that sounds good. It was an opportunity to write for a cast of like 20 young people. And it's not often as a writer you can write a play for 20 actors. And also have a piece of work where it was being commissioned and you were automatically gonna get it on.
Right. So what keeps you inspired to write plays for young audiences?
I think what keeps me inspired is seeing young audiences. That whenever I see a play with young audiences in it, it's watching the reactions of people who may not have been to the theatre very often, and also watching the kind of way young people watch with wonder. And there's something about writing for young audiences, which is that a young audience, I think, will go in and not have any preconceptions of what they're about to see, and will go away thinking about it and potentially challenged, and you may have changed or planted a seed. Whereas I would say that adult audiences, of course you can provoke them and raise questions, but most adults enter an audience having already, being set on their rules of life and what they think about things. Whereas I think as a young person, you're still struggling with that, you're still making decisions, and there's a really amazing place that art and theatre can have in helping provoke ideas and shape those ideas. So I think that really inspires me, is the challenge as a writer of what you can do for a young audience that you can't do for an adult audience.
Do you define any difference between writing a young character for an adult audience play, and young characters in a young people's play?
I don't think there is a difference in the way I approach writing young characters for an adult play or for a young people's play.
Right.
In that, I think you have to write the character truthfully. I think what you were hitting on, which is, and I don't want to be negative about people's writing young people. Sometimes when I see plays for adults, and it happens very rarely in plays for young people, when you see a young character, and as you say, they can be very wooden, or I feel like really two-dimensional, I would often say that's just because it's not just that the writer may have not written for young audiences, but the writer may have not been around young people. And it's this assumption of, this is what a young person is.
Do you think it's also maybe to do with that most plays that are written for young audiences or young people, the context of the play is usually a world that young people kind of behave differently in, whereas a lot of adult plays, it's about a young person being within an adult world.
Yeah.
Do you think that might have any bearing on how those characters come across?
Yeah, and I think part of that is how much work and how much we learn about a character depending on their prominence in a play. And in lots of plays for adults, if there's a young character, they can be, not always, but a side character. Particularly I find in an adult play where you have a character who's under the age of 10. There are definitely adult plays where there are teenage main characters, but the side characters where they're just to bring out things in the adult relationships.
Yeah.
And so you have a 10-year-old who's like, "Mummy, blah, blah, blah." And I don't know any 10-year-old who speaks like that, or who's like, "Oh, Daddy, I'm so glad you're home." And I have seen plays like that, and I think that's, go meet a 10-year-old. And so, yeah, I think you're right that when you're writing a play for young audiences, often you're, not always, but often there are characters who are young people and are in surroundings of young people and other young people. So you really hone in on the behavior of those young people. And I feel like there's a challenge when you know it's going to be a young audience to really push yourself to be as truthful to those characters and that your audience is going to identify with. Whereas I feel like at times when you're writing for an adult audience, you can get away with more maybe, because your audience aren't going to be saying, well, I'm going through that now and that's not what it's like. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that search for authenticity that you have as a writer?
I think the search for authenticity comes from spending as much time with young people as you can, and really observing as you're doing work with them. And I think the more you can talk to young people, the more authenticity you'll get. So I go in with lots of questions, and I never go in, if there's anything I already have an answer, I don't bother asking it, because to me then I'm not actually going to get anything authentic out of them if I've already made a decision. So I go in and really try and provoke questions amongst young people and see how they respond to that, which I find is quite good at giving me something really truthful. I've done lots of things again where I get them to write things, sometimes anonymously, so I can sort of get a more truthful response from young people. And often I find one of the best things to do is, especially if it's a group of young people I don't know very well, is start them on discussions, but in their own small groups and with each other who they feel comfortable with. And then, but where they are comfortable with me being an observer of that. Because actually getting them to talk to each other is a really great way of getting something real. And one of the biggest ways to test that is, once I've written something, is bringing it to young people. And I often, even if the play is not being performed by young people and is being performed by professional actors, adults or young professionals, I get young people to perform or play around with the work, because hearing it in their mouths, seeing how they react to it as they're coming to terms with it as actors, is really telling for me of what's working, what's not working, what they feel is really contrived, and what really challenges them.
What's been the most challenging commission or project for you as a writer?
I think there's a project I'm working on now which I'm finding really challenging, which is How Is It For You, which will be on Unicorn this summer. And it's a verbatim piece of theatre, and about the Olympics. And I found it really challenging because I've never worked in direct verbatim like this before. So the constraints of having to create a drama, there's lots there amongst what I've been given. And I think, in a way, actually, it was how I find a way in that's going to be interesting for young audiences. Because the play is not really about young people. And how to get, the challenge has been how to get young people interested in some of the deeper questions I have about the Olympics going on in London, and the politics of it. I thought, when I started Holloway Jones, which is the play that Theatre Centre has given me the Brian Way Award for, one of the challenges, as we briefly spoke about before, was that I was the first time I was commissioned to write a play that was going to go to schools. And as a writer, thinking, how do I write a play that won't be in a theatre? Where actually things which are given, like if I need a light or this can be done, a change of scene through a blackout or some transition, where suddenly that I knew that at least in some schools, I might have nothing. So full lights, this kind of light on, big noisy hall, teachers going in and out. That was a huge challenge. And even something we assume if you go into an audience, go into a theatre and the audience is in the dark, so we automatically get a focus on the stage, that I wasn't going to have any of that at my disposal. And suddenly it felt like it was my responsibility as a writer to provide ways around that. To say, okay, well, how am I really going to keep the action going? What am I going to use in replacement of potentially what I would normally use lights for, or leave to the director to use lights for? And how am I really going to focus us in on intimate small moments when we're in a potentially giant space and there's nothing to direct our focus to that space? And how can I use my writing and the language of the piece to do that? So that was a big challenge. And so with that, I started playing around with both how video was used a little bit in the play, but also a chorus that came out that spoke in a kind of street rhyme verse that helped to segue us between things, but also worked really well for the storytelling of the piece.
Can you offer a top tip or any advice for a writer who's just curious, interested, starting out writing for young audiences?
I think my top tip would be go see plays for young audiences. And when you go, try and split your focus between watching the play, which of course it's going to be helpful to watch what's been written by people, but more importantly, watch the audience. See what grabs them. What I find is really helpful with my own work, obviously, but also when I go see other plays around people, is watching those moments when an audience seems really grabbed and really attentive. And what is it beyond? Is it just the story? Is there an innovation they're using in the storytelling that's really grabbing them? And when are the moments when that audience is getting really restless? Because one thing I think about young audiences that we have to remember, and it was another challenge, we're about to say, for Holloway Jones going to schools, but even theatres, is lots of young people don't necessarily choose to go to the theatre. So your audience there haven't necessarily bought their own ticket and said, this is a play I want to see, I'm going. So you're suddenly given this challenge that you have to work that little bit harder to grab them in, as opposed to when I go to a play, I think, well, I bought the ticket, I paid the money, I go in hoping this is going to be a great, hour, 2 hours, 3 hours of my life, and I'm kind of invested from the start. Where sometimes it's like, well, mom told me I have to do this, or this teacher told me I have to sit here and watch this. So look at how those plays really grab those young people when you watch the audience. And the other tip is hang out with young people. Find ways that you can work with young people, or assist someone who's working with young people, to find out what young people want.